I'm Ethan Carter, 35, and I never imagined a kitchen renovation would become the day I felt truly invisible. I'd been a carpenter since I was 20, fixing up our first house room by room. On that sweltering June morning, I was under the sink cabinet adjusting the pipes for the new island when everything changed. Madison, my wife of 8 years, had gone out for brunch with her sister Emily. She said they'd be gone half the afternoon. The plan was simple: pull out the old vinyl, install European oak planks, finish by dinner. I prided myself on precision, but pride doesn't protect you from betrayal. I heard the front door click. I froze, tools clinking as I shifted. Madison and Emily slipped inside, voices low and urgent. "Have you told him I'm moving in with you next month?" Emily's tone was soft yet ruthless. My knuckles whitened around the wrench. I lay still, every muscle tensed. Madison laughed, cold practiced. "Not until I nail down the promotion. Give it 2 more weeks, then I'm gone." They spoke of secret bank accounts, of splitting our savings, of an apartment Emily had found downtown with white walls and giant windows, just the kind Madison loved. They talked logistics like generals planning an invasion. My heart pounded so loud I thought they'd hear it. I pictured packing my life into boxes, leaving before she ever said goodbye. Panic surged, then a bitter clarity. I would not be the gullible fool she thought me. When they finally left to finish shopping, I crawled out chest tight as a drum. My tools felt foreign in my hands. The kitchen was half torn, half rebuilt. Dust motes danced in the shaft of sunlight where betrayal had just taken root. I stood there for what felt like hours, probably only minutes, listening to the hum of our fridge. In that stillness, rage and resolve fused into one cold promise: I would see this renovation through to the end. And when it was done, she'd learn exactly how wrong she was about me. Without a sound, I packed away my wrench and wiped sweat from my brow. The real work was only beginning. Ethan Carter sat at the kitchen island before dawn, the new European oak planks gleaming faintly under the single overhead bulb. Steam curled from his coffee mug, carrying the acrid scent of betrayal. The house was silent, save for the soft hum of the fridge and the distant caw of a lone crow perched above the garage. In the pale light, his latest tool set lay organized on the counter like soldiers at attention. Chisel mallet precision saw each one a testament to countless hours spent rebuilding this place. Now they felt like instruments in a darker symphony. He ran a hand over the smooth grain of the countertop, thinking that everything worth having had once been rough-hewn, shaped by pressure and heat into something stronger. His reflection in the glass cabinet door looked back at him. Eyes rimmed red, jaw set so tight it ached. He'd spent years believing our home was our fortress. Madison's secret conversations under this very sink had proven otherwise. At that moment, he realized his renovation would no longer be merely aesthetic. It would become an act of reclaiming every splinter of dignity she had tried to chip away. He took another sip of bitter coffee, feeling the warmth spread through him like resolve, and made his first decision. He would not be the predictable husband she'd counted on. His next call would not be to his best friend Anthony, but to someone who understood the art of turning raw wood into masterpieces, the retired master carpenter who had taught him everything. With that thought, Ethan grabbed his coat and stepped into the cool morning air, ready to carve out a new plan in the grain of his life, one that would test the limits of his own integrity and courage. He found old Mr. Harlan in his cluttered woodshop behind a paint-chipped barn at the edge of town where fragrant sawdust drifted like snow through half-lit windows. The old man looked up from a workbench cluttered with turned spindles and exhaled through his nose at Ethan's determined stance. "You're up early," Harlan said, voice gravelly but warm. Ethan set down his coffee and revealed the battered wrench from his own surgery beneath the sink, recounting every overheard word, every hidden bank statement, every stolen cent meant to fund fertility treatments. The mention of Madison's secret apartment lease made Harlan's eyes flicker with both anger and sympathy. "Revenge is a tantalizing grain to follow," he mused, running a weathered finger along a piece of walnut. "But it can splinter your soul if you're not careful." Ethan pressed his hands into his pockets as though restraining a trembling blade. He wasn't asking for caution, he needed strategy. They spoke of leverage timing disclosures to maximize impact, gathering documents, recordings, and witness statements, ensuring no legal loopholes. Harlan stroked his beard. "Risks in every cut you make, but a clean line is forged by knowing what to leave and what to remove." He tapped a blueprint of cabinetry, eyes twinkling. "Let's sketch the next moves." As Harlan pored over the floor plan, Ethan felt a spark of hope ignite an ember of conviction that honoring his own worth might require walking a knife edge between justice and obsession. And so, with the smell of pine and oak swirling around them, a clandestine alliance was born, one that would soon test every moral plank under Ethan's feet. Back home, the kitchen was halfway transformed, new cabinets gleamed, but the backsplash lay incomplete, as if awaiting the final flourish. Ethan inhaled the scent of fresh grout, then slipped beneath the island cabinet again, not to eavesdrop this time, but to plant a silent trap. He installed a tiny motion-activated recorder, its red LED hidden behind a sliver of unfinished trim. Each plank of flooring he nailed down felt like a nail in a coffin. Not Madison's, but the version of himself that had trusted blindly. With every cut of his saw, he dissociated from anger, channeling it into exacting craftsmanship. The kitchen became his canvas, but also his fortress of solitude, where he could refine his plan away from prying eyes. As he worked, he discovered a scrap of paper wedged behind a baseboard, a hastily scrawled note from Madison dated 2 weeks earlier. "We'll start fresh at 25 Maple. No turning back." The handwriting was familiar, every loop of the M a ghost of the intimacy they'd once shared. For a moment, Ethan's hand stilled the saw blade hovering over raw oak. He realized that beneath Madison's cold ambition lay fear. Fear of being stuck. Fear of changing, fear of the unknown. And yet she'd cast him aside in pursuit of her next chapter. Anger flared, then mixed with pity. He pressed a finger to the note and slid it into his pocket, heart pounding. The twist in his story was not just that Madison had betrayed him. It was that her betrayal was rooted in the very insecurities he had vowed to protect her from. Clutching the note like a severed lifeline, Ethan rose from beneath the cabinet with renewed purpose. The next step would require confronting that fear, hers and his own. A flash of memory hit him as he lifted the last box of tiles the day they closed on this house. Madison in a crisp white dress, tears of joy brimming as they signed the papers. He'd thought their vows were stronger than any ink on a contract, stronger than any beam supporting this roof. Now that same house was a battleground for truths neither had bartered for. He paused at the living room window, watching the sunrise paint the street in gold, a reminder that endings can also herald beginnings. In his mind, he recited the lines from an old sermon his grandfather used to quote, "A broken vessel can still hold living water." But what good was holding living water if the vessel itself was cracked beyond repair? The social expectation of marriage as sacred had become a noose around both their necks, she suffocating under its weight. He gasping for the air of authenticity. He realized he'd been playing parts written by tradition rather than living a story authored by his own choices. The realization felt like a chisel striking a stubborn knot in wood, painful but necessary. He set aside his tools and stepped outside, breathing deeply, resolving that, whatever came next, he would not let the old scripts dictate his ending. He would rewrite the final act on his own terms, but first, he'd have to face Madison in the arena she'd prepared, and that thought both terrified and galvanized him. That afternoon, Ethan attended a charity mixer where Madison's promotion would be celebrated, a risky foray into her domain, dressed in a suit so pristine it felt borrowed. The hall smelled of polished oak floors and expensive perfume. Madison, in a sharp navy skirt and pearls, smiled as colleagues toasted her success. Ethan watched from the edge of the crowd, glass of iced tea in hand, every ounce of him straining to remain composed. He collected stray snippets of conversation, whispers about her relentless drive, half jokes about her work-life balance challenges. A cluster of HR people floated by, and Ethan subtly introduced himself to a woman named Karen, who'd once handled his safety training at the renovation site. He congratulated Madison when she approached, offering a measured hug that left her eyebrows arching in surprise. She expected cold shoulder or confrontation, not civil warmth. As they chatted, Ethan noticed her relief. She even laughed a genuine bright sound, and he felt a pang of guilt. But beneath the light, he saw the steel, the same resolve that had driven her to betray. He excused himself to the restroom, splashed cold water on his face, and stared into the mirror. The reflection showed a man at a crossroads, play the hero in her story, or the author of his own destiny. He straightened his tie and stepped back into the ballroom with a new tactic charm as a shield and a sword. At that moment, he decided to undermine her reputation, subtly planting conversations about her secret financial endeavors among the staff, using carefully worded half-truths that would breed doubt without risking libel. As he returned to the crowd, he caught Madison's eye, and for a heartbeat, the world narrowed to their silent standoff. Hers expecting compliance, his plotting the next move. Later that day, Ethan bumped into Emily at a quiet cafe, a place where the barista knew their names. Emily's expression was a study in regret. Her usual bright cheer had dimmed. They sat across from each other with lattes between them, the steam forming fragile halos. Ethan asked her softly why she'd helped Madison. Emily's eyes flicked to the window and she sighed. She said she was trapped, that nobody would understand. "I thought I was helping her find freedom." Her voice cracked on the last word. He pressed gently, and she confessed Madison had confided in her about feeling stuck in the small-town expectations of marriage and family, craving a life unbound by tradition. Emily admitted she'd felt torn uplifted by Madison's ambition, but uneasy about the cost. As they talked, Ethan realized Emily was both accomplice and victim of a cultural script that told women ambition and loyalty couldn't coexist. He leaned forward, offering her a chance at redemption. Testify to the conversations, reveal the hidden accounts, help him finish what he'd started. Emily's eyes filled with tears, and she clutched his hand. "I'm scared of her wrath," she whispered. Ethan squeezed back, voice calm but firm. "You'll be safe. This ends now." As he stood to leave, Emily reached into her purse and pulled out a flash drive. "Everything's on here," she said, voice trembling. "But once you use this, there's no turning back." Holding the drive felt like holding a detonator. One choice could level both her world and theirs. That night, alone in the kitchen's half-finished glory, Ethan plugged the drive into his laptop and watched folders named Accounts, Moving Plan, and Contacts fill the screen. Each file was a brick in Madison's fortress of deceit. The glow of the screen illuminated his face in sharp relief, shadowed hollows under his eyes, a crease of determination at his brow. He reviewed transcripts of messages, scanned photos of envelopes and keys, even found recordings Emily had made on her phone. Every line of data ate away at his anger, replacing it with something else: sorrow for how ambition can corrode trust, for how societal pressures can warp genuine love. The more he uncovered, the more he realized the path he'd mapped for revenge was leading him to a moral precipice. Would exposing Madison destroy him as well? He ran his fingers through his hair and stared at the screen. In the quiet hum of the laptop, he heard echoes of his own doubt. At that instant, something inside him shifted. He no longer wanted to be the avenger who shattered another life. He wanted restoration, if not for Madison, then for himself. But forgiveness felt like a luxury he couldn't afford. His thumb hovered over the folder named Final Release, the damning dossier he'd intended to leak to the press and her colleagues. The cursor blinked, impatient, waiting for his decision. Ethan closed the laptop and sat in darkness, surrounded by the skeleton of a dream-turned-nightmare side. He lit a single candle on the island, its flame quivering like a fragile hope. In its glow, the polished countertop gleamed one last time. Memories flooded back the day they planted the maple tree in the backyard, laughing as sap stained their hands. The night Madison insisted he build her a bookshelf that turned on their living room into a sanctuary of shared stories. Those moments weren't erased by her betrayal, they were proof of something real. He realized the choice before him wasn't binary revenge or blind forgiveness. There was a third path, one that required the greatest courage, the willingness to walk away with his dignity intact, leaving her to bear the consequences of her own actions without his hand pushing her over the edge. He blew out the candle, plunging the kitchen into darkness, and felt a weight lift from his chest, even as a new anxiety took its place. Tomorrow, Madison's promotion announcement would go live, and behind her back, he'd decided not to orchestrate her ruin, but to formally serve divorce papers and walk out the door. The risk was immense, her wrath, social judgment, the whisper campaign he'd already started, but the alternative was living as someone he no longer recognized. He lay down his head on the counter, listening to the thrum of the night heart pounding with both fear and relief, unsure of what dawn would bring, but certain he'd finally reclaimed his own story. The next morning, he would face her one last time, and the outcome would determine whether he remained the carpenter he'd always been or became something altogether new. I woke before sunrise, the kitchen island's polished surface cold under my palms. The divorce papers lay on the counter, ink still glossy from the copier's drum. For a moment, I stared at my reflection in the window, fragile outlines of a man who once believed in forever. I felt the weight of tradition pressing down on me, the wedding photos in the hallway, the maple tree we'd planted on our first anniversary, the promise that two hearts could build a home stronger than any storm. But Madison had torn that promise to shreds the day she plotted my erasure beneath this very sink. Now I was the one clutching paper as both weapon and shield. Hands trembling, I folded the stack into my jacket pocket, each crease echoing a decision I could never unmake. I brewed a cup of coffee, inhaling its bitter promise of clarity, and rehearsed my words, gentle yet unyielding. Outside, the morning sky spilled pale light across the driveway. I stepped into my truck, knowing that with each mile toward the house I once called ours, I was driving deeper into a battlefield of emotions, and there would be no easy retreat. The street was quiet as I parked in front of Madison's car, its windshield beaded with dew. My heart pounded against my ribs like a hammer on a nail, each thump insisting I turn back. But retreat was not an option. I gripped the door handle and felt the echo of every time she'd applauded my craftsmanship, never guessing how I'd use it now to rebuild myself. The mailbox at the curb, once a cheerful pop of red, looked sinister, guarding secrets I was about to unleash. I walked up the front steps, breath catching like a sprung trap, imagining neighbors peering through curtains, wondering what domestic tragedy had unfolded. I raised my hand and knocked the sound harsh in the stillness. Inside, I heard the faint clatter of plates, Madison's lunch call to her sister Emily, or perhaps another co-conspirator in her plan. The door swung open before I could second-guess the moment, and there she stood in a crisp blouse, eyes wide, as if she'd forgotten what trust felt like, and I realized I was moments away from shattering the illusion she'd curated so meticulously. Ethan, her voice cracked a tremor, betraying the poise she wore like armor. I offered a calm smile and produced the papers, their stark white, a dagger between us. "We need to talk," I said, voice steady enough to hide the chaos within. She stepped back, confusion flitting across her features before hardening into anger. "Is this really necessary?" she asked. But the tremor in her lip said otherwise. I handed her the petition, each page, a testament to lies overheard under that sink and secrets buried in journal entries and bank statements. As she read, her expression morphed through shock, guilt, and finally fury. The papers rustled in her hands, soundtracked by the ticking clock on the wall. I watched her face in profile, the way her jaw clenched, the sudden gloss in her eyes. In that moment, I understood revenge's true power, not in the tearing down, but in the irrevocable shift of hope. And as she looked up, trembling, I realized the battle had only just begun. Her first words were a venomous litany of betrayal accusations that I'd recorded her without consent, that I was manipulating our history for a twisted victory. She waved the pages like a flag of accusation, her voice rising enough to draw Emily from the next room. But beneath her fury lay something raw pain unmasked by pretense. She'd rehearsed her defenses, yet every sentence stumbled over the truth she could no longer deny. My chest constricted, not with triumph, but with sorrow, the ache of dismantling the dream we once shared. I took a careful breath and replied with measured calm, reciting facts, the secret account, balances, the lease agreement, the note I'd found behind the cabinetry. Each revelation was a plank removed from the floor beneath her feet, and I saw the ground tremble in her eyes. When her voice finally faltered, I held my gaze, no triumph, only solemn resolve. In the hush that followed, I realized that exposing her plan was less about punishment and more about demanding mutual recognition of what our life had become. Emily hovered at the doorway, eyes swollen with regret. She clutched a mug like a talisman against guilt, her presence reminding me of how easily loyalty can warp into complicity. I nodded to her, acknowledging her silent confession, then turned back to Madison, whose shoulders sagged as if the weight of her own ambition had knocked her off balance. The silence was thick, heavy as uncut wood, and in it I heard the echo of every lie she'd spun. For a moment I glimpsed the woman I'd married, her laughter in the backyard, the way she'd traced her fingers over my carpentry sawdust-smeared shirt. But that memory was flickering, unstable. I realized our marriage had grown a hidden rot nourished by unspoken resentments and unmet dreams. In that quiet, I reached for something braver than revenge, forgiveness, not for her sake, but for mine. Yet forgiveness felt almost as risky as retribution, an admission that I was willing to stand naked in the wreckage of us and rebuild from the ashes. I held her gaze and asked, voice soft, "Do you want to talk about why we lost our way?" Her hollow nod answered more than words ever could. We retreated to the living room, where the couch sagged in the center, a monument to late-night conversations and half-falling asleep cuddles. I sat on one end, she on the other, and laid the original recordings on the coffee table like a time capsule of betrayal. I spoke of shared beliefs that love should be a partnership, that trust is the cornerstone of any home, that ambition shouldn't require erasing those who stand beside you. Her eyes flicked to the speaker and back to me, fear and longing warring in their depths. Emily hovered behind her sister, a living testament to family bonds twisted by secrecy. As I unpacked the events I wove in my own failure, the nights I'd prioritized work over conversation, the way I'd let suspicion fester in silence instead of addressing the distance between us. In that moment, I exposed not just her treachery, but my own blind spots, acknowledging the societal pressure that binds couples into unspoken roles, the quiet resentment that grows when expectations go unvoiced. When I finished, the room felt stretched taut like sandpaper smoothing rough wood. And as Madison exhaled a shuddering breath, I knew the real test was just beginning. She broke first, her voice trembling with a mix of apology and fear. She spoke of her ambition of feeling trapped by tradition and longing for freedom. Her words stumbled over the accusations she'd laid at my feet. The room felt too small for such confessions, the air thick with unspoken heartbreak. I realized that in her quest for autonomy, she had weaponized our vows, believing divorce papers were the only blueprint for rebirth. But I saw a different path, one that required courage to dismantle without destruction. I suggested we try mediation, a neutral space where truth could be aired and futures reshaped. Her lip trembled. Skepticism fought with relief in her eyes. Emily exhaled behind her as though releasing a held breath. The very idea of negotiation cracked the foundation of Madison's plan, no swift exit but a slow unraveling of our intertwined lives. As she weighed the offer, I felt the social currents tug at us. Divorce stigmas whispered judgments among friends, the shadow of community expectations. Yet I also felt a surge of hope that we might redefine our beliefs, shaping new roles from the splintered remains of our past. And when Madison finally nodded, the fragile truce hung in the air. The following day, we met at a small office overlooking Main Street, where sunlight pooled on the conference table like promise. The mediator, a composed woman named Laura, greeted us with measured kindness. I noticed Madison's hands tremble as she unpacked her folder, while I set my own documents with practiced precision, mindful of the symbolism in order and clarity. We sat facing each other, the table a symbolic threshold between our shared history and the futures we sought apart. As we spoke, Laura guided us through financial disclosures, living arrangements, custody of hopes once pinned on children we never had. Each question felt like carving a dovetail joint, requiring exacting attention to ensure a seamless fit. Social beliefs about marriage and divorce hovered unspoken in the room. That separation is failure, that splitting assets equals splitting identities. Yet as I calmly advocated for fairness, equal division of savings, a share of the rebuilt kitchen's equity, I felt the power of reason over rancor. Madison's voice wavered, but she met each point with unexpected grace. When we broke for coffee, I realized that negotiating our split was the most daring act of trust I could offer. Trust that we could part as adults, not adversaries. Driving home, I passed the oak tree we'd planted together, its leaves flickering like green embers in the afternoon sun. It had grown into something strong and beautiful, despite storms and seasons. I felt that same resilience in myself, a conviction that life could flourish even after the hardest cuts. The mediation had gone better than I dared hope. We'd reached an agreement on finances, divided our belongings equitably, and set a timetable for living arrangements that honored both our needs. It wasn't the revenge script I had drafted beneath the sink. It was something stranger and more profound, a reclamation of dignity through fairness, not ruin. Yet I carried the scars of betrayal, and I'm not naive enough to believe forgiveness comes easily. As I turned into my driveway, I noticed a for sale sign already staked at the old house. In its shadow, I felt a pang of loss and a flicker of anticipation. The house wouldn't sell for months, and each passing day would remind Madison of the life she'd left behind and of the secrets she thought buried in its walls. I parked my truck and sat for a moment before stepping out, the engine ticking down like a heartbeat. I wondered how long it would take before the wounds dulled enough to let new growth emerge. That evening, I poured myself a beer on my back porch, the sky bruised with dusk. The empty space where Madison's laughter once echoed felt cavernous, yet my chest wasn't tight with rage anymore, just the hollow ache of transition. I thought about the carpenter's creed measure, twice cut once. Life had forced me to relearn that precision of the heart, discerning when to hold firm and when to let go. A neighbor ambled by, nodded, and kept walking. No gossip, just the quiet acknowledgement of a man rebuilding his world. I raised my bottle to the fading light and whispered a silent toast to integrity over impulse, to building something new from the rough-hewn remains of the old. The oak tree's silhouette swayed in the twilight breeze, reminding me that roots push upward even under the weight of darkness. I leaned back, feeling the wood beneath me solid and real, and let my thoughts drift to tomorrow when I'd begin house hunting, pack tools into a new van, and lay the first plank in a life defined not by someone else's expectations, but by my own careful craftsmanship. The path ahead was uncertain, and that uncertainty both thrilled and terrified me. But for the first time in months, I felt ready to face whatever came next. Night settled around me, and I closed my eyes, imagining the next chapter. There would be hard days, moments when the knife edge between regret and relief would sharpen to a scream. But there would also be mornings when I'd wake to the symphony of birdsong, rather than the tension of hidden conspiracies. I pictured a workshop of my own tools lined up like old friends, each one ready to carve new stories out of raw wood. I saw myself hosting small gatherings of trusted friends, not to conceal secrets, but to share laughter. And sometimes I thought I might drive by that house, see a different family planting their own tree in the yard we once watered together. I might feel a pang after all memories are the grain that runs through every heart. But I'd also smile knowing the house still stood on a solid foundation, rebuilt with truth, resilience, and respect for the craft of living well. As the last light vanished, I rose and flicked off the porch light, stepping into darkness. Not with fear, but with the quiet conviction that even the strongest beams can be reshaped, and that the most meaningful renovations sometimes happen within. Ethan stood barefoot on the raw pine floor of his new cottage, mug of black coffee warming his palms while morning light filtered through dusty windows. The place felt both foreign and familiar, a blank canvas after months of legal wrangling and plastered anger. He ran a fingertip across a knot in the wood, remembering Madison's whispered ambitions under that sink cabinet, and wondered if any home could ever be free of hidden rot. Yet here he was, ready to build something honest for once, guided only by the grain beneath his feet and the steady beat of his own resolve. Tradition said a man's worth was measured by the solidity of his house and the harmony inside its walls. His past had proven how hollow that could be. Now each unsanded board beckoned him to redefine what home meant beyond marriage vows and social expectation, beyond the gilded performance of success. He sipped his coffee, tasting possibility in its bitterness, and laid out a simple plan demo: the outdated vinyl repair rotten beams, install new joists, and restore the place with his own two hands. But even as he charted the first step, he felt the familiar tug of doubt. Would this project heal him or simply remind him how many planks he'd already lost? Kneeling in the center of a room that hadn't seen care in decades, Ethan pried up strips of cracked vinyl, each curling piece revealing the scars of past neglect. Dust swirled like restless spirits around his headlamp, and the rhythmic popping of adhesive under his chisel sounded to him like echoes of memories he couldn't unhear. As he exposed raw subfloor, he found something unexpected: a small heart-shaped carving etched into a plank of oak, smoothed by time and countless footfalls. He paused, chisel suspended, and considered the anonymous artisan who'd pressed that symbol into the wood long ago, perhaps a way to claim love in a house that felt too vast or too lonely. The find felt like a message across generations, reminding him that homes carry stories beyond deeds and titles. But as he knelt there, the distant rumble of traffic on the nearby highway reminded him that this neighborhood stood on shifting social fault lines. Gentrification had brought him here, yes, but it also forced longtime residents to watch their world transform around them. Was he a restorer of dignity, or just another outsider carving out his own haven? The heart-shaped etching lay beneath his palm, a question knocking at his chest. Ethan tucked the plank into his tool bag, then knocked on the adjacent door to introduce himself to Mrs. LaRoche, the elderly woman who'd lived here 50 years. He found her in a floral housecoat, staring through the lace curtains at the same heart-shaped carving he'd discovered. Her eyes widened with recognition and sorrow when he explained his intentions. "That symbol marked my husband's promise," she whispered. "He carved it before he shipped overseas, swore he'd return." Her voice trembled, and suddenly Ethan's renovation was no longer just wood and nails, but a fragile promise of renewal and remembrance. He retrieved the carving and handed it back. She ran her fingers over it, tears glistening. He felt their shared loneliness in that moment, two souls trying to breathe life into old beams. Complicating the warmth, he knew neighbors watched skeptically, a single man with a contractor's van stirring concerns of skyrocketing property values. To them, he was a harbinger of displacement, not community revival. With Mrs. LaRoche's gratitude still warm in his chest, he wondered if he could bridge that divide. Could he restore the cottage without fracturing the neighborhood's trust? The door closed gently behind him, and the weight of that challenge settled between Heartwood and Hope. Word spread that Ethan planned to host an informal workshop, DIY restoration for good. He called it, where he'd teach basic carpentry and donate his labor to any neighbor in need. Some raised skeptical eyebrows. Why would a recently divorced newcomer invest generosity instead of profit? But curiosity outweighed suspicion, and a handful of residents showed up one Saturday morning at the cottage. He set up his old wooden sawhorses in the yard, carved out his grandmother's rolling workbench, and laid out chisels, hammers, and salvaged oak planks. He invited Mrs. LaRoche, a young single mother named Rosa, and even Miguel, the gruff landlord down the block, who'd once threatened to evict a family for falling behind on rent, who arrived with a toolbox of his own and a grudging curiosity. As the group learned to plane wood and replace damaged studs, Ethan told them his story: how betrayal had once hollowed his spirit like dry timber, how revenge had lost its allure when measured against the dignity of honest labor. His voice wavered only once when he spoke of the fertility fund Madison had raided, but he pressed on, inviting everyone to refashion their own broken moments into tools for repair. By noon, the workshop had transformed a timid crowd into a community of makers, fellow craftsmen, mending both walls and old wounds. As they shared sandwiches on a tattered blanket, Ethan realized that connection demanded vulnerability and that risking his heart in this way was far more perilous than any courtroom battle. That evening, while cleaning up, he noticed the sky shifting from rose to slate thunderheads rolling in like silent witnesses. He stood on the porch with a battered radio, listening to the weather alert heavy storms predicted overnight. In this place, rain meant seepage mold collapse. Old houses bore the weight of every drop. He grabbed extra tarps, secured loose boards, and directed volunteers to reinforce vulnerable spots, coordinating by flashlight as dusk turned to downpour. Each torrent of rain felt like a personal trial testing the bonds he'd forged. In the dripping gloom, he saw faces illuminated by lanterns. Mrs. LaRoche's stoic determination, Rosa's fierce protectiveness over her children, Miguel's reluctant camaraderie as he tightened a beam that held up the cottage roof. The storm became a crucible forging trust in place of suspicion. Yet as the wind howled like an accusing spirit, Ethan understood the irony. It was easier to sue someone for betrayal than to stand shoulder to shoulder with them against a storm. When the rains finally eased, dawn revealed a battered but standing cottage, and a group transformed by shared trial. He felt his heart swell with something like redemption, but the distant rumble of thunder reminded him that calm was always temporary, and that tomorrow's storms could come in more insidious form. A few days later, as the neighborhood workshop gave way to routine repairs, Ethan received a text that made his blood run cold. Madison had posted a commentary on a local blog accusing an unnamed contractor of invasive tactics that prey on vulnerable homeowners, complete with thinly veiled references to secret recordings and emotional manipulation. The piece had gone semi-viral, stirring whispers among the very clients he'd hoped to help. He stared at his phone, heart slugging against his ribs, the logger's axe in his hand, suddenly feeling like a symbol of every misstep that had led to this moment. For a split second, he considered abandoning the cottage, packing up his tools, and retreating from the public eye. But then he remembered the faces during the storm, Mrs. LaRoche's hand on his shoulder, Miguel's gruff nod of solidarity, and he realized that retreat would be a betrayal far greater than Madison's. He typed a measured response on the blog's comment thread offering transparency, sharing the heart-carving story, inviting skeptics to visit the cottage, and reaffirming his commitment to honest craftsmanship and community service. His thumbs trembled on the keys, each word weighing on his conscience. When he hit post, the line between personal ruin and communal trust felt razor-thin, yet he pressed on, ready to stand by his own narrative, no matter the fallout. That evening, as the last light faded, Ethan sat at the built-in window seat he'd crafted from salvaged oak, drink in hand, watching fireflies dance through the dusk. The blog comments trickled in. Some accused him of spinning a false narrative. Others thanked him for his candor, and a few curious souls asked when the next workshop would be. He realized that in a world wired for outrage and quick judgment, authenticity was both a shield and a risk. The oak carving from Mrs. LaRoche, now sanded and sealed on the windowsill, glowed golden in the lamplight, a beacon of connection that defied the cynicism swirling online. He traced its smooth edges and thought, our lives are a series of carvings, some of hope, some of betrayal, some of resilience. Each mark reveals a belief that can either bind us or set us free. Tomorrow he'd pour concrete for a new threshold, lay fresh joists for the hearth, and teach another neighbor how to nail a proper dovetail joint. But tonight he sat with the quiet knowledge that rebuilding meant bracing for every storm, external and internal, and that sometimes the greatest risk was choosing honesty over self-preservation. As a lone firefly blinked against the gathering dark, he wondered which belief would guide him through the next trial. I woke before dawn again, the pink rim of sunrise barely brushing the horizon as I scrolled through my phone. Overnight, the blog comments had ballooned into a small storm, accusations of opportunism, questions about my motives, even veiled threats of legal action. But beneath the noise, there was something else too. A message from a prospective client named Harper Blaine, owner of an old Victorian 2 blocks from here. He'd heard about my DIY restoration for good workshop and wanted me to breathe life back into his family home, which had stood vacant since his mother passed 2 years ago. I hesitated taking on a large-scale project, so soon felt reckless, especially with Madison's shadow still looming over every beam I laid, but the raw integrity of his email tugged at me. He described peeling paint like sunburnt skin floors, sagging under the weight of ghosts, and a stained glass window that held stories waiting to be retold. I knew agreeing would mean plunging deeper into public scrutiny, just as I was trying to reestablish the quiet boundaries of my life. Still, my blood hummed with the promise of honest work, and I typed back a tentative yes. Before I sent it, I paused, thinking of the oak heart carving Mrs. LaRoche had entrusted to me, a reminder that even battered structures can harbor enduring love. With a breath, I hit send, stepping into risk once more and wondering what secrets Harper's house might whisper to me next. By mid-morning, I was squinting up at the Victorian's turret windows, their stained glass muted by years of dust. A wrought iron gate groaned as I shuffled through, boots crunching on cracked pathways lined with choking ivy. The place smelled of mildew and memory's faint perfume mixed with the sour bite of neglect. Harper met me in the foyer, tall and gaunt, wearing a tweed jacket that looked as if it belonged in another era. He shook my hand with cautious hope eyes, flicking around the vast space as if searching for a sign that I might fail. We toured the muddy ground floor, a parlor where the wallpaper peeled in ragged strips like dying skin, a dining room with chandeliers draping cobwebs, and a kitchen that had once been grand but now housed nothing but debris. Then he led me up a narrow stairwell to the attic where beams crisscrossed like skeletal ribs beneath the low roof. In a corner, I noticed a spider's web shimmering in a ray of light. Delicate yet resilient, its architecture a silent testament to survival against neglect. I crouched to inspect a loose plank and saw a faint carving, the same heart shape I'd found downstairs in the cottage. My breath caught. Reaching around, I pried the board free to reveal a folded page tucked behind it. Harper watched me with an anxious tilt of his head as I smoothed the yellowed parchment open. The first words read, "To the one who dares to restore this place, know that these walls have witnessed more than time can tell." My hands trembled as I leaned closer, knowing that the next line would change everything I thought I understood about this house. As I read the letter aloud to Harper, the attic air felt suddenly charged like static before a thunderclap. The writer, Harper's great-uncle, it turned out, spoke of a secret room hidden behind the east wall where his sister had stowed away love letters and family heirlooms before vanishing during the Depression. He urged the finder to reveal the truth only when the world was ready, warning that greed and scandal had once nearly ruined the family's name. Harper's eyes darkened at the mention of scandal, and he swallowed hard, confessing he'd hesitated before contacting me because he feared unearthing painful legacies. I felt a rush of adrenaline. Here was a discovery more profound than any broken joist or peeling wallpaper. It demanded a choice: keep the secret buried to spare Harper public shame, or bring it to light and risk reigniting old social judgments and family pain. My pulse drummed in my ears as I weighed the carpenter's credo of honesty against the human cost of airing history no one asked to relive. Every instinct urged me to preserve dignity, but another voice whispered that unearthing truth was itself a form of rebuilding. I folded the fragile page carefully and met Harper's gaze, knowing that declaring what we'd found could ripple far beyond these rafters. I left the Victorian with a letter in my pocket and a knot of questions in my gut. On the drive home, I passed the community garden where neighbors congregated every weekend, and for the first time since the blog uproar, I felt the sting of judgment at my back. As I pulled into my driveway, my phone buzzed again. This time a terse email from an attorney representing Madison's PR firm. They accused me of defamation and intentional intrusion, demanding I issue a public apology or face legal consequences. My chest tightened. The letter's words burned behind my eyes, and Madison's voice echoed in my mind, too predictable to fight back. I knew the safe move was to delete the letter, retract my public statements, and bury every ounce of evidence to avoid a costly lawsuit. Yet I also remembered what Mr. Harlan said: risk is the grain you follow when you truly believe in something. I realized I was at another crossroads, facing a test of conviction more daunting than choosing revenge. If I capitulated, I'd lose the respect I'd earned in the community workshop and betray every neighbor who'd trusted me with their homes and hopes. But fighting meant plunging back into a public battle, draining resources I needed to rebuild my new life. I paced the living room, heart hammering, as the afternoon sun slanted through the window seat and illuminated the oak heart carving my talisman of faith and honesty. With a steadying breath, I composed a reply to Madison's lawyers. I would not apologize. I would stand by the truth, and I would share the attic letter with Harper and the neighbors. Whatever the cost, I was resolved to see justice through or be broken by the effort. That evening, I hosted a small gathering at the cottage. Mrs. LaRoche, Rosa Miguel, and a few others from the workshop. The cottage felt warm and alive for the first time, the soft glow of low-hung bulbs refracting off the heart carving on the sill. I laid the attic letter on the coffee table alongside magnifying glasses and a simple wood frame I'd crafted to preserve it. I explained the discovery, watching their faces shift from curiosity to empathy. Mrs. LaRoche reached out her finger, tracing the script and shaking as she held back tears. Rosa's children peered wide-eyed, imagining hidden rooms and lost treasures. Miguel crossed his arms silent before clearing his throat to ask, "What do you plan to do with this?" His question hung in the air, a social conundrum about what responsibility a community holds to its own ghosts. I felt the weight of that responsibility settle on my shoulders. These people had trusted me not just with their homes, but with their stories. If I hid the letter, I'd betray their faith. If I published it, I might shatter Harper's world and risk regulatory scrutiny over an unlicensed archaeological find. I opened my mouth to speak, but the floor creaked under my weight, echoing the creaking beams of the attic. In that pregnant silence, I realized the real restoration I sought was not of wood or walls, but of trust between neighbors. My answer came on a breeze that rustled the curtains. I would display the letter prominently in the refurbished parlor, giving it the reverence it deserved, and invite the community to a history unveiled open house once the work was done. We would honor the family's legacy and allow Harper to tell his own story in his own words. The room exhaled collectively relief, mingling with anticipation. Yet, as plans formed, I felt a new tension coil inside me. The developer who'd been eyeing the block for a multi-unit condo conversion had caught wind of the house's potential historic significance. If the attic letter became public knowledge, it might halt or delay the project, enraging wealthy investors and pitting me against a power far greater than Madison's lawyers. The social stakes spiked. This was no longer a matter of private betrayal, but a battle over community identity and the right to preserve memory in the face of gentrification. I looked at the faces around me, some hopeful, some wary, and understood that my next move would shape more than a single renovation. It would set a precedent for how our neighborhood valued its past and whether the heart of a community could withstand the pressure of profit. As the chandelier above us flickered, I felt the pull of the wider world pressing in, and knew I was about to step into daylight again, where nothing remained as simple as an oak plank waiting to be sanded. Under the street lamp glow that night, I drove past the Victorian on my way home. Through the windows, I saw Harper standing alone in the parlor. Letter in hand, surrounded by blankets and buckets of paint, a solitary figure on the verge of transformation. The house seemed to inhale, as if aware its story was about to be rewritten. I thought of the spider's web in the attic, an intricate structure built from seemingly fragile strands yet capable of withstanding storms, and felt its metaphor pulse in my veins. If I could teach a community to weave new connections from the frayed threads of history, maybe we could resist the easier slide into anonymity and replace it with a tapestry of shared purpose. The road ahead was fraught with risk lawyers ready to pounce, developers circling like vultures, neighbors torn between progress and preservation. But I pressed my hand to the glass of the passenger window, as if sealing a pact with the night itself. Tomorrow I would meet with Harper to plan the open house. I would brief the neighbors on what to expect, and I would stand ready when the developers or the lawyers tried to bulldoze us again. In that silent moment, I felt an ember of something fierce and new, an inner strength carved from trials past, and I whispered into the dark, "Let them come." The world beyond the windshield waited, pressing in with its contradictions and challenges, but I was no longer the man under the sink, powerless and betrayed. I was the carpenter of my own destiny, ready to build with truth as my foundation and let the rest fall where it might. At home, I placed the oak heart carving back on its windowsill and lit a single candle beside it. Its flickering light danced across the room, reflecting in the glass pane like twin flames of memory and hope. I thought of Madison's voicemail pleading for a meeting, her voice raw and apologetic, another twist I'd yet to answer. But tonight, I let it go to voicemail. Instead, I opened my workshop bench, chose a fresh plank of cherry wood, and sketched out plans for the open house invitation, each line a deliberate act of creation rather than reaction. The soft scratch of pencil on paper felt like a small rebellion against chaos. The storm outside intensified, wind rattling the panes, but inside I felt a calm resolve I'd never known when the world had demanded I be predictable. I had choices now to reveal the attic's secrets, to stand with my neighbors against forces that valued profit over people, and to write the next chapter of my life not as a victim, but as a catalyst for something greater. I traced the grain of the cherry plank, imagining it transformed into a door plaque, bearing the words, "History lives here." Then I set down the pencil, closed my eyes, and let the steady rhythm of my own heartbeat guide me forward. The world outside might tremble under its own storms, but in that moment, I was exactly where I needed to be, ready to carve out new truths and build a future that honored every scar, every secret, and every spark of resilience that had led me here. I woke before dawn, the sky still ink black, when I stepped onto the porch, clutching the carved cherry wood invitation I'd hand-lettered. The oak heart carving sat at the center of my bench like a beacon, its smooth contours glowing faintly in the soft glow of the porch light. Inside the cottage smelled of fresh paint and warm wood shavings, an aroma I'd come to associate with second chances. My chest throbbed with anticipation as I ran through the day's schedule, one last time welcome speeches for Mrs. LaRoche and Rosa, a tour led by Miguel, then the big reveal in the attic. I paused at the threshold, hand trembling as I fitted the new brass key into the lock. Tradition says a home's worth is measured by its walls, but I believed it was actually measured by the stories those walls kept safe. Today, all those stories would be laid bare, and I'd stand before friends and skeptics alike, ready to defend both my craft and my integrity. Guests trickled in just as the first blush of sunrise painted the sky salmon and rose. Mrs. LaRoche clutched a bouquet of wildflowers. Rosa's two children darted past with gummy smiles, and even Miguel shuffled in arms crossed, but eyes bright with pride. Harper arrived with his father, the lawyer who'd helped me draft the open house disclosures proof that we'd tread carefully between honesty and privacy. Among them hovered a representative from Apex Development, clipboard in hand, eyes scanning every beam and joint, measuring potential return on investment. I greeted each person at the door, heart hammering, when the rep offered a polite nod rather than the sneer I half expected. "Impressive work," he said quietly, and I felt a flicker of unease. Had I misread my own motives? Then, just as the gathering buzz rose, the rep cleared his throat and announced he had some updates about the neighborhood's future, his voice smooth as sandstone, masking the razor beneath. Stepping into the living room, I guided the group past the stained glass window. We'd restored its jewel-toned panels, casting refracted patterns on the oak floors. I paused by the mantel where the oak heart carving now sat in a custom niche, sunlight streaming over it like a halo. Turning to the assembled neighbors and friends, I spoke of community memory and the carpenter's creed that honesty is the strongest joint, tighter than any dovetail. Heads nodded as I described the attic letter's history, how it belonged to Harper's great-uncle, a plea to honor family legacy without succumbing to greed. A murmur of approval rippled through the odd crowd, but at the edge of my vision, the developer rep's smile sharpened. He leaned to his colleague and whispered something I couldn't catch, then drifted toward the parlor where an early seating chart hinted at a press corner. My palms dampened with sweat. If the wrong words reached the media, our careful balance could shatter. Harper stepped forward next, his lanky frame silhouetted against the pastel light. He cleared his throat and led us up the narrow stairwell, explaining that the attic held more than rafters, it held a secret room his family had sealed during the Depression. My heart pounded as he pushed aside a discreet panel in the east wall to reveal a shallow alcove. Inside lay a leather satchel draped over a stack of weathered letters and tarnished brooches. He lifted each piece reverently, reading aloud passages of forbidden love and loss that echoed across generations. Gasps rose and fell like tides. I saw Mrs. LaRoche dab her eyes. Rosa's children leaned forward in awe, and Miguel's stoic jaw softened. Then Harper unfolded a folded map that hinted at another hidden compartment behind the fireplace hearth. My breath caught, the carpenter's instinct surged, urging me to uncover even deeper truths. But a glance at the developer rep, now scribbling furiously in his notebook, reminded me that revelation could become liability. Just as we descended, voices drifted from the front door, sharp familiar heels clicking against the threshold. I felt a cold wave of dread. Madison had arrived. She swept into the room, tailored blazer and pearl earrings catching the morning light, eyes flashing as she surveyed the scene. A hush fell over the crowd, her gaze locked on me. Then, the attic letter Harper still held. She perched on the edge of a chair, arms crossed, and asked in a voice smooth as alabaster, "What exactly is going on here?" There was a reporter lingering by the drinks table, phone in hand. Madison's lips curved into a calculating smile as she launched into a poised accusation. "I've heard rumors of unauthorized recordings, breaches of privacy, and slanderous claims against an innocent man." The silence that followed was strangling. My heart threatened to bolt, but I steadied myself, recalling every transcript and document. I stepped forward, cool and composed, ready to show the disclosures everyone had signed and to expose the truth Madison had tried to bury. Madison's facade cracked the moment I presented the signed releases and the mediator's letter confirming our agreements. Her jaw dropped as I calmly explained how she'd consented to the recordings as part of our mediation process, how she'd even initialed the privacy policy with her own pen. Gasps fluttered through the crowd. Mrs. LaRoche's hand flew to her mouth. Rosa's mother glared daggers at Madison's retreating form. But before the moment fully settled, the developer rep cleared his throat again, raising concerns about zoning implications and historic designation clauses that threatened to freeze his planned condo project. The community looked to me, and I realized this was my next battleground: protect Harper's heritage and our neighborhood from the bulldozers of progress, or risk losing everything we'd poured our sweat into. A murmur of defiance rippled through the guests as they formed a semicircle around me, united by shared history and collective will. In that charged pause, I felt a surge of something warm and fierce belonging. With the neighbors at my back, I turned to the developer. Quietly but firmly, I laid out the facts: the attic letter's historical significance, our agreement to honor privacy, and the community's vote to pursue landmark status that would protect the Victorian from conversion. The rep's expression faltered under the weight of homeowners' stares, people who'd learned to swing hammers, plane beams, and stand up for what mattered. He closed his notebook with a soft thud, realizing the tide had turned. As he excused himself, Madison lingered at the doorway. Tears streaked down her cheeks, mascara smudged like artless brushstrokes. She met my gaze for a moment, no anger, just regret, and then she fled the click of her heels, fading into the morning hum. I exhaled, tension unraveling as waves of relief washed through me. The cottage felt alive again, humming with collective triumph, but I knew the real work was just beginning. In the aftermath, the local historic council granted preliminary approval for landmark status, putting the developer's plans on indefinite hold. Harper's family home was officially recognized as a cultural treasure, and neighbors rallied to form a preservation committee. My workshop bench became a hub for plans, designs for adaptive reuse, schedules for volunteer painting, and spreadsheets for fundraising. I felt my old life slipping away, replaced by a new role: caretaker of memories, mediator between past and future. Each nail I drove into new joists felt like a promise, a commitment to build not just walls but trust. Late one evening, I stood by the parlor window, gazing at the oak heart carving framed by moonlight. I ran my finger along its curves, thinking of every risk I'd taken, the choice to defend truth over convenience, to teach neighbors rather than litigate against them, to face Madison with integrity instead of vengeance. The world outside remained imperfect, gentrification pressures still pulsed in the air, and whispers of profit-driven agendas lingered on the wind. But inside, I felt an unshakable foundation settling beneath my feet. Months passed, and the neighborhood thrived on newfound solidarity. We turned to one another for small favors, lending tools, swapping paint tips, sharing ice cream cones on hot afternoons. Mrs. LaRoche hosted monthly tea gatherings where she recounted stories of the home's past, weaving tales that made Red Brick Lane feel like the axis of something larger than any single life. Rosa organized a children's club, teaching them to saw simple birdhouses from scrap wood. Watching their laughter echo through backyards was more satisfying than any paycheck I'd ever earned. Even Miguel softened, swapping eviction threats for offers of rostered help, his rough hands learning the delicate art of finishing trim. I found myself forging friendships that felt stronger than nails and screws. My own heart, once shattered by betrayal, was mending in the consistent rhythm of shared labor and honest conversation. Yet, on quiet nights, I still caught myself glancing toward that cottage, our epicenter, wondering if this fragile harmony could withstand the next storm. Tonight, I stand at a new project site, a long-forgotten community hall that's fallen into disrepair, its stage collapsed, windows boarded. The local arts council wants to transform it into a performance space for underrepresented voices. I trace the faded outlines of once grand moldings and imagine curtains billowing under soothing light. In my pocket rests a small carving, a miniature oak heart I whittled as a gift for Harper, symbolizing our journey. I press it between my thumb and forefinger, feeling its edges worn smooth by hope and hard work. A group of volunteers trickles in, artists, retirees, children, each bringing fresh energy. As I sketch out the restoration plan on a pad, I realize the work isn't just about wood and stone, it's about giving voice to stories that might otherwise be forgotten. My chest swells with resolve as I lay down the first line, phase 1 clear. The debris expose the structure, reveal the soul. The echo of my pencil scratching paper resonates like a hammer on beam, forging new promise in the grain of a collective dream. And as the sun dips below the rooftops, I step forward, chest unclenched, ready to build another chapter, emotionally intact, guided by the belief that true craftsmanship lies in strengthening both structures and spirits. Story 2, I'm Rowan Hayes, and I'm 31 now, though for most of my childhood I felt much younger, like a timid bird trapped in a gilded cage. It wasn't until last month, when I finally enacted the plan I'd carried for years, that I realized how much I'd learned to survive in that house. But let me start at the beginning. I was 8 when my mother Elise married Michael Donovan. He arrived with his 2 daughters, Ella and Tilly, both 10 identical twins with bright eyes and synchronized laughter that echoed through our small suburban home. For the first few weeks, Michael seemed kind. He brought board games on family nights and let us stay up late to watch cartoons. Mom smiled in a way I hadn't seen since I was little before Dad disappeared. But I noticed the first crack when Michael announced college savings for Ella and Tilly. "They deserve the best," he said, ruffling their hair. I beamed at being included in their world until Mom added, "We'll see about your fund later, sweetheart." I nodded, but my heart sank. I was 9. I didn't know that later meant never. Over the next few years, the favoritism grew sharper. Ella and Tilly got new phones on their birthdays. I got the hand-me-down. They had curated closets. My dresses came mismatched. I never complained, and complaining earned shameful looks from Mom like I was ungrateful. My best friend Sarah Nguyen noticed. She'd visit on weekends and I'd curl up on my bed and cry into my pillow. Sarah listened. She told me I was brilliant, creative, and deserving of every bit of kindness. She was the only constant in my life besides my little brother Max from my mom's first marriage. Max was 6 when Michael and Mom tied the knot. He had Mom's golden hair and my stubborn chin. Michael tolerated him barely, but he never let Max forget that Ella and Tilly came first. One afternoon, I watched from the hallway as Michael helped the twins with their homework while Max stared at his empty desk. When he asked for help, Michael barked, "I'm busy with the real kids. Go find your sister." I pressed my hand to Max's shoulder, but before I could speak, he scuttled away. By middle school, the pattern was clear. I existed to support my step-siblings. They were invited to school trips. I rode the late bus alone. They got private tutoring. I scraped by on after-school study sessions with Mr. Patel, my math teacher, who offered help because he saw the fear in my eyes. He became a secret ally. He'd slip encouraging notes into my locker and praise my work in front of classmates. I treasured those scraps of kindness. When I turned 14, Mom and Michael announced a grand vacation. They'd rented a lakeside cabin for 2 weeks. Ella and Tilly squealed. Max looked thrilled. I tried to smile. Last year at the Grand Canyon trip, Michael forced me to sleep in a camper while the rest of the family shared the cabin. I thought maybe this time would be different. One steamy July evening, I crept downstairs for a glass of water. The living room was dark except for the glow of Michael's laptop screen. He was on the couch, arm draped over Mom's shoulders. They were booking a Mediterranean cruise by themselves. My stomach twisted as I heard Michael say, "Why waste money on Rowan? She's never appreciated a thing. $2,000 on her would be stupid." Mom's quiet agreement cut deeper than any insult. "You're right. She's just like her father, always wanting more." Dad, my real father, hadn't walked out because he was deadbeat. Mom told me that lie for years. I froze, then stepped into the light. Michael's arm tightened on the couch. "So I don't get to go?" I asked, voice trembling. Their faces fell into a mix of surprise and irritation. Michael shot back, "This is an adult decision. Maybe next time," and tried to turn back to the screen. I took a deep breath. "You called me a mistake. You said I was worthless." My words hung in the air. Mom's eyes filled with guilt, but she said nothing. Michael stood, and his grip on my arm left bruises. "I don't owe you anything," he spat. "You're not my child." I stumbled back, catching myself on the doorway. My lip quivered. "You're right," I whispered. "I'm not yours." Then I ran upstairs past Max's room into my own sanctuary. I locked the door, sat on the floor, and cried until my tears ran dry. That night, I packed what I could into my backpack: a change of clothes, my journal, Sarah's friendship bracelet, and the only cash I had, $40 saved from mowing lawns. I pressed close a sealed envelope I'd found months earlier tucked between old textbooks. It was addressed to me in my real father's handwriting, postmarked from Seattle. My heart pounded every time I held it, but I was too scared to open it. In the morning, when I crept downstairs, I found the front door wide open and my backpack gone. My clothes lay in battered trash bags on the lawn. A furious Mrs. Dixon from next door watched from her porch. "I saw your stepfather tossing those bags," she said quietly. "I tried to call your mother, but she wouldn't answer." My throat closed up. I was 15 without a home? I dialed Sarah's number with shaking fingers. Her mom, Mrs. Nguyen, answered on the second ring. I told her everything in bursts of hiccuping breaths. She drove over in minutes, whisked me inside, and refused to let me leave until I calmed down. Over the next few days, Mrs. Nguyen called school, the police, and countless social workers. I begged her not to involve them. I felt shame that my family had exposed me like trash. But when I returned to my room one afternoon, I found the golden envelope wedged under my pillow. Inside were 11 birthday cards, all unopened, all returned to sender, each postmarked from the same Seattle address. The last card contained a folded letter. My hands shook as I read it on his office letterhead. My father pleaded for a chance to see me, enclosed a small check for support, and begged Mom to let me visit. I sank to the floor breathless. Every lie Mom had told me shattered in that moment. My real father hadn't abandoned me, he'd fought to find me. The fury that rose inside me was hotter than any tears. I smiled through the clenched teeth. I didn't know yet how I would rebuild my life or what revenge would look like. But I knew one thing: I would never let them write my story again. I still remember the clatter of that envelope hitting my pillow like a challenge thrown down at my feet. I spent the next morning pacing Mrs. Nguyen's living room, clutching the letter to my chest, heart pounding with an odd mix of fear and anticipation. Every story I'd told myself about who I was shattered the moment I read those words in my father's handwriting. It felt like standing on the edge of a cliff, exhilarating and terrifying all at once. I knew I had to find him, to look him in the eye and demand the truth, but I wasn't sure if I was ready to see the man behind the promise. So I did what any uncertain teenager with no home would do. I collected every detail I could. The postmark, dates, the handwriting, quirks, the tiny emblem on the letterhead that matched an old family photo I'd scraped from Mom's attic. I memorized every nuance as if it were a code, guiding me back to the father I never truly knew. But every step felt risky. What if I knocked on the wrong door? What if I was about to crash into someone else's carefully constructed life, and yet, despite the doubts buzzing in my mind like angry wasps, I felt something new taking root. A growing conviction that I deserved answers. That conviction pushed me toward the one lead I had the private investigator Dad mentioned in his letters, and I dialed the number before I could talk myself out of it. And for a moment, everything stood still. The first time I met Mr. Fletcher, I expected a smoky office with dim lights and dusty files. Instead, his workspace was sunlit, lined with bright pamphlets and children's drawings tacked to the wall. He poured me tea and said, "I've been waiting 14 years for you to call." His voice was calm, but his eyes flickered with something raw, regret maybe, or hope. As he spread yellowed photographs and faded letters across his desk, I felt the weight of that lost decade press down on me. Each image was a fragment: Dad holding a lollipop at my second birthday, 2 mismatched boots left on the porch after he tried teaching me to ride a bike. The deeper I looked, the more I realized how much Mom had erased. She'd wiped clean the calendar of my life, and now I was rebuilding it frame by frame. But Clark Fletcher, the man with kind eyes and a gentle smile, warned me this journey wasn't just discovery, it was reckoning. He said, "Your father never stopped fighting for you. He just didn't know where to look." That twist made my chest ache. I'd spent years believing I was abandoned when in truth I'd been misplaced. And with every new piece of evidence, the world I thought I understood slipped further from my grasp, leaving me standing at the crossroads of forgiveness and fury. Empowered by Fletcher's files, I booked a bus ticket to Seattle with nothing but a backpack and a heart full of questions. As the city skyline emerged from the morning mist, I pressed my forehead against the cold window, feeling the weight of every mile I'd left behind. My skin prickled as I stepped off the bus. This was no longer a dream or a back-of-the-envelope plan. It was real life with all its uncertainties and dangers. What if Dad had changed? What if Mom had warned him? The thought sent a sharp pang through my chest. Still, I clung to the symbolism of the journey. I was crossing waters, not just roads, moving from the wreckage of my past into the uncharted territory of truth. Seattle's air felt different, salt-sweet beneath the pines. I walked to the address in Fletcher's files, hesitating in front of a modest duplex painted ocean blue. The door knocker, a brass whale, gleamed in the afternoon sun, the same whale from the corner of Dad's letters. My pulse raced as I raised my hand. Every step felt like tossing a pebble into a still pond, knowing the ripples would reach far beyond me. I knocked once, twice, and held my breath as the door swung open. He stood there taller than I'd imagined, shoulders stooped, as if burdened by years of waiting. For a moment I saw myself reflected in his eyes, same freckled brow, same anxious tremble of the lips. He swallowed, voice breaking, as he whispered, "Rowan?" I nodded, words caught in my throat like fishhooks. He stepped aside and I passed the threshold, feeling the threshold itself pulse beneath my feet like crossing from one life into another. The living room smelled of pine and coffee, and on the mantel sat the old wedding photo I'd never seen my parents, young and smiling with me wrapped in Dad's arms. I reached out, fingertips grazing the glossy surface as memories of smiles I'd never experienced trickled through me. Dad's voice shook. "I've dreamt of this moment. I've missed you every single day." He gestured to the sofa and we sat face to face, 2 halves of the same broken story. As he began to recount the years he spent searching, I realized I was no longer that frightened girl on a stranger's lawn. I was the author of my own story now. Yet even as relief washed over me, a knot of tension tightened in my gut. Because standing in that sunlit room, reunited at last, I knew the hardest part lay ahead, deciding what to do with the mother and stepfather who'd erased me, and whether forgiveness was possible when the wounds still ran so deep. And so we talked until the sky darkened, tracing the map of my lost childhood in every confession and apology. By the time I rose to leave, I carried something heavier than the backpack on my shoulders, the resolve to reclaim my life on my own terms. But the knot in my gut was more than fear of what lay ahead. It was the beginning of a storm I had to weather alone. Because out in that Seattle night, while Dad drove me to a small hostel he'd booked, I realized revenge was no longer a distant plan. It was a promise I'd whispered to myself, and I wasn't yet sure if I was willing to pay its price. I spent the next few days in Seattle with my father, trying to bridge the vast gap between the years I'd missed and the man who had somehow survived the absence. His apartment was small, yet it felt like a sanctuary, a space carved out of his years of regret and hope. He was patient, never rushing me to talk, and we spent hours just sitting in silence, sorting through old photos and letters. It was easier to breathe here in a place where I didn't have to hide who I was or feel the weight of expectations. But as comforting as his presence was, something inside me kept pulling me back to the storm I'd left behind, the storm of betrayal that was still simmering in the background. And with every passing day, the idea of returning to face my past began to solidify into something I could no longer ignore. I couldn't stop thinking about Mom and Michael, about how easily they had discarded me when they no longer had use for me. It wasn't just the cruelty, it was the calculated way they'd erased me from their lives, as if I was a mistake they could forget. I had a right to feel the rage building in me, but the harder part was figuring out what to do with that anger. The old me, the girl who used to hide behind a smile to avoid confrontation, had long since disappeared. In her place stood someone new, someone who wasn't afraid to take risks. I'd learned to survive by making others believe I was weak, but now I understood that true power came from knowing exactly when to break your silence. It was late one evening when I finally asked my father the question that had been gnawing at me since I first arrived. "Why didn't you ever give up on me?" His answer wasn't what I expected. It wasn't filled with sorrow or self-pity. Instead, it was matter of fact. "I couldn't give up, Rowan. You were never the problem." I stared at him, the words hanging between us like a tightrope. For years I had been taught that my existence was a burden. I'd believed that the space I took up in their lives was one too many. But now I saw the truth. My mother's bitterness wasn't about me. It was about her own inability to make peace with the choices she had made. And there it was, the revelation I had been waiting for. I wasn't the broken piece. They were. It wasn't me who had failed them. They had failed me. They had failed themselves. The weight that had been pressing down on my chest for years started to lift, but with it came a sense of responsibility. I wasn't just carrying my pain anymore, I was carrying theirs too. The challenge now was what to do with it. As the days passed, I began to formulate a plan. It wasn't enough to move on to just start a new life with Dad in Seattle. I needed to make them understand the weight of what they had done, the consequences of treating a child like disposable garbage. But revenge. True revenge wasn't just about getting back at them. It was about showing them the truth they had buried so deep that they would never be able to escape it. I needed to expose their hypocrisy, their lies, and make them face the damage they'd caused. I spent hours late into the night staring at my phone screen, researching Michael's business dealings. The more I dug, the clearer it became Michael was a man with too many skeletons in his closet. His business was a house of cards teetering on the brink of collapse. His investors were growing restless, and there were rumors of embezzlement and poor financial management. Michael had tried to bury his past, but it had a way of clawing its way to the surface. It wasn't just about humiliating him anymore. I realized that the best way to tear down the empire he'd built on lies was to destroy the very thing that kept it all standing, his pride. The moment I decided to take action, I felt a shift inside me. It was like stepping out of the shadows for the first time and realizing that the world was wide open. But the more I planned, the more the stakes grew. I had to be careful. One wrong move and I could lose everything. If they found out what I was doing before I was ready, I'd be no better than the scared, broken kid they had left behind. The risks were enormous, but so was the reward. I reached out to an old contact, someone I'd known through my father's legal team when I was younger. His name was Derek, and he was a sharp, calculating, and ruthless. I knew I could trust him with the delicate details of my plan. We met in a small, nondescript cafe on the edge of town, and I explained everything to him: my years of abandonment, my mother's manipulation, and Michael's lies. Derek listened without interrupting, his eyes narrowing as I spoke. When I finished, he nodded slowly. "You've got your work cut out for you," he said. "But if you're serious about taking them down, we can make it happen." The plan was simple in theory, but I knew it would require precision and patience. First, I needed leverage, something they wouldn't be able to wriggle out of. I had already collected enough to take down Michael's company, but what about Mom? How could I hold her accountable for her role in all of this? The answer came to me one night as I sat in Dad's apartment staring out the window at the rainy Seattle skyline. It wasn't just about the money they had stolen or the lives they'd ruined. It was about their guilt. I reached out to Ella and Tilly, hoping to strike a deal. They'd been silent since I left. Their lives moved on as if I had never existed. But something had changed. Caleb, their older brother, reached out to me after years of silence. He told me things weren't good at home. Michael's business was failing, and Mom was unraveling under the pressure. They were drowning, and he didn't want to be part of it anymore. Caleb's confession gave me the final piece of the puzzle. I had the power to expose Michael, to pull the rug out from under his entire facade. But the real twist, the one that would break them, was Mom. She was the keystone. Without her loyalty to Michael, the whole structure would crumble. The problem was, I knew she wouldn't go down without a fight. And if there was one thing I learned growing up, it was that people like her would do anything to keep their power intact. I was ready to face them, but I knew it would be a battle, a final reckoning. It was time to return home to confront the people who had once claimed to love me and to show them just how much I had learned in their absence. But as I packed my bag and prepared for the confrontation, something gnawed at me. Was I still doing this for revenge, or had I become something else, someone who had simply learned to survive no matter the cost? I wasn't sure yet. All I knew was that the storm was coming, and I had no intention of running from it. It was a strange feeling, returning to the house that had once been mine. As I drove through the familiar streets of my childhood neighborhood, the old streetlights flickering in the twilight, I realized how much I had changed. The house with its chipped paint and faded hedges seemed smaller now, like a forgotten memory. The world outside felt new, but the weight of everything I had left behind was still there, lurking just beneath the surface. I parked my car across the street, not wanting them to see me just yet. A part of me was still the scared teenager who had once watched my life be thrown out in garbage bags. But I wasn't that person anymore. I was someone else now, someone who had the power to destroy everything they had built on lies. The air was thick with tension as I walked up to the front door. I could see the faint glow of lights inside the shadows of movement through the curtains. I knocked once, the sound echoing in the silence, and waited. A minute passed, then two. My heart hammered in my chest, but I stood there, rooted to the ground, unwilling to back down. And then the door opened. Michael stood there looking the same, his sharp jawline, the ever-present scowl, the suit that seemed too expensive for a man who had been losing everything. He barely looked at me, his gaze darting around as if he expected to see someone else. "What do you want?" he asked, his voice clipped, dismissive. I swallowed my anger, keeping my voice steady. "I came to talk. You know about all those lies you've been telling." Michael's face tightened, the muscle in his jaw twitching as he stepped back, opening the door slightly wider. "You've got 5 minutes," he said, motioning for me to come inside. The house was a ghost of what it had once been. Luxurious but hollow, decorated with expensive furniture that looked out of place in a home full of secrets. I sat down, my fingers curling around the edge of the chair as I looked around. "You've made a lot of decisions, Michael. A lot of them at my expense," I said, my voice cold. "But that stops now." He chuckled, but there was no humor in it. "What are you gonna do? You think you can just waltz in here and tear everything down? You're nothing. You've always been nothing." His words stung, but I didn't flinch. I was done being the victim. The truth had been buried under his lies for far too long, and now I was the one in control. "You're right about one thing. I'm nothing to you, but you..." I said, my voice low, steady. "You've built your life on lies, and now I'm here to show you how easy it is to take it all away." Michael's eyes narrowed, but before he could respond, I pulled out the folder I'd been carrying. The documents inside weren't just the financial records I had uncovered, they were his undoing. I laid them on the table in front of him. The evidence was damning proof of his mismanagement, his embezzlement, and the lies he had fed to his investors. "You've been using my name, Michael," I said, "saying I cost you everything, but the truth is you were drowning long before I left." He slammed his fist on the table, the papers scattering across the floor. "You have no idea what you're talking about," he yelled, his face flushed with rage. "You think you can destroy me? You think you can ruin everything I've worked for?" I stood up slowly, my movements deliberate. "You did that yourself. All I did was watch." I turned and walked toward the door, the weight of the moment pressing down on me. I wasn't just exposing him, I was exposing everything he had built his entire life, a house of cards built on manipulation and deceit. But there was still one more thing I had to do. The next step was inevitable. I had to face Mom. As much as I hated it, I knew I couldn't leave this chapter unfinished. When I arrived at the house, she was sitting in the same chair I had once sat in, her eyes vacant, staring at nothing. She looked up as I entered, and for a split second I saw the faintest flicker of recognition in her eyes, like she was seeing the daughter she had abandoned all those years ago. "You don't belong here," she said, her voice shaky. "You never did." The words hit me like a punch to the gut, but I wasn't the same girl who had believed every word she said. "You abandoned me, Mom," I said, my voice trembling with the weight of everything I had held in for so long. "You threw me away like I didn't matter." She stood up abruptly, her face twisted with anger. "You were a mistake," she shouted. "I never wanted you to begin with. You ruined everything, Rowan. Everything." Her words were like knives, but they no longer had the power to wound me. I had spent years trying to earn her love to make her see me as something more than a burden. But now I saw her for who she truly was, selfish, manipulative, and incapable of seeing past her own desires. "I'm not your mistake," I said, my voice steady. "I'm not the one who ruined everything. You did that." Her face contorted with rage, but I didn't flinch. I had nothing left to lose. The years of emotional abuse, the lies, the manipulation, they had all led to this moment. She had tried to erase me to make me disappear. But now it was her turn to face the consequences. Before she could say anything else, I pulled out the final piece of the puzzle, the recording. The recording of her and Michael laughing, joking about how they were going to take the money and run, how they would leave me behind without a second thought. It was the final nail in their coffin. I played the recording, watching her face drain of color as she heard her own voice on the tape. The betrayal was complete. She tried to deny it, but the evidence was irrefutable. "You'll never be able to take me down," she hissed, her eyes wild. "I have connections. I'll destroy you." But it was too late. I had already won. I wasn't the scared little girl anymore. I wasn't the child they had thrown away. I was the one holding the cards now, and they had no idea how badly they had underestimated me. As I walked out of that house for the last time, I felt the weight of the years I had lost finally begin to lift. It wasn't the revenge that had healed me, it was the truth. I had fought for my own redemption, and in the end, I was the one who walked away unbroken. But as I stepped into the world beyond those walls, one thought lingered. Revenge had been sweet, but the freedom I felt was so much sweeter. I had made them nothing, and in doing so I had finally made myself everything.